Hello, my name is Dr. Paul-Elliott Cobbs, and I'm here to talk to you about the first symphony written by an African American composer. It was called the Afro-American Symphony, written by William Grant Still. This is a landmark work in not only orchestral music, but in cultural authenticity and the importance of black music in America. To truly understand the importance, and by the way, this is the original score. I was gifted this score. The score is from 1930 when the symphony was written. So to truly understand this work, we have to go all the way back to the time where Dvorak was invited to New York at the New York Conservatory of Music. He was invited to come and compose and to help America decide how could it create a unique music. Up to that time, most musicians who were serious musicians studied in Europe, and the composers learned to compose in a European style. So there was a big search, a big quest to find a uniquely American music. Dvorak stayed 3 years, and we have some great works as a result of that. One of the works was the Symphony number 9. We call that the New World Symphony, as you all know. The American String Quartet, as well as the Cello Concerto. So all three of these works were done as Dvorak was here. What you might not know is that Dvorak's assistant conductor was Harry Burleigh. Burleigh was African American, and he specialized in singing Negro spirituals. His grandfather was indeed a slave. His grandfather taught him work songs, hollers, call and response songs, but most of all, spirituals. Burleigh was a fantastic singer, and he not only performed spirituals, but he wrote them himself. Burleigh was a very big influence on Dvorak. At the end of Dvorak's stay, he said, if you want to have music that is truly American, you need to play music from the people. And from the people, he meant Negro spirituals, blues, that type of idiom. However, it took 30 years before that type of music was put into a symphonic form. And we call that the Afro-American Symphony, and the composer was William Grant Still. William Grant Still is still considered the dean of African American composers. So let's take a look at his life. He was born in Mississippi. He first of all played oboe and cello. And his first education was at Wilberforce College. From there, he went to Columbus, Ohio, and he met a very influential person, H.C. Handy. Now, we know of H.C. Handy as the creator or father of the blues. Up to this point, Still had never heard that type of music. And so by working with H.C. Handy, Still decided, I like this. This is very authentic. This is a good thing to do. And so he learned about the blues, but not only blues, he learned about spirituals as well. And so this was the first introduction in a long line of meetings that would influence Still and lead him to write this symphony. So he played in Handy's orchestra, he played oboe and cello. After that, he decided he wanted to go to Oberlin, so he saved enough money to go to Oberlin, but his studies in Oberlin were interrupted by the war, the World War I, and he served in the Navy during World War I. When he came back, he decided, well, now I'll join a different band. And this time he went to New York. And again, he met Handy. And Handy decided that I'll have you work for me, not just playing in my orchestra, but for my publishing company. And in New York, Still met so many Negro, as they called them at that point, performers. He learned so much about the blues, so much about spirituals, so much about authentic African American music and its roots. So after Handy's publishing company was dissolved, Still took off, and he was offered a job in this band called From Dixie to Broadway. Now by that time we're looking at 1922. So 1922 to 1925, he toured all over the U.S. in this band, this musical band called From Dixie to Broadway. What was important in his time there was the fact that he would go to these little churches, these small churches in the deep South. He'd sit and he'd listen to the music. This is music he's never heard before. So he heard spirituals, and he heard gospel. He heard authentic African American church music. This inspired him. He was very touched by it. And in the Afro-American Symphony, we find all of these things present. This was a turning point in his composition career. Up to now, he had been trying to imitate the late Romantic composers, the avant-garde composers, but he wasn't satisfied because he felt it really wasn't expressing the Black experience. However, when he would frequent these churches, he felt moved. What's important also is that this was the time when William Grant Still was at his lowest. Emotionally, he was distraught because of a failed marriage. Financially, he had no money. He was destitute, and he turned to God. So when he went to these churches, it wasn't just about the music, it was about trying to heal himself as well. And these songs, this musical expression, was something that William Grant Still found very, very impressive. So, if you would go to a small Black church, you would hear a call to worship. And in this Afro-American Symphony, the English horn opens up the symphony with somewhat of a call to worship. This call to worship was normally sung by the minister or a deacon, and the congregation would answer. You have all the elements, we call them blue notes, these particular melodic notes that are fashioned in a way that it's not major or minor, but they're called blue notes. You'll find many blues scales that has these notes, but long before the blues, these were songs sung in the church by slaves. Burley's grandfather actually was a slave who earned his freedom. And so anybody who's been to a black church in the Deep South in the 20s and 30s, 40s, would know these songs and would know the treatment of the blue notes. As for me, I was with my grandfather, who was a Baptist minister in the South, and I would go to services with him when I was a young boy, and these exact songs were sung. Now, I didn't know what kind of notes they were, but they were blue notes, and so I remember them. And it was just a wonderful thing watching people listening and watching people very attentive. And so William Grant Still picked up on that. In 1930, he wrote his Afro-American Symphony, and he used all of these things that he had learned in the symphony. So let's take a look at the symphony. As I said, this is his original score. In the first movement, it begins with what I like to call a call to worship in the English horn. It sets the mood, it sets the theme, and you have all of these blue notes that we just talked about. From there, we have a 12-bar blues theme played with the trumpet with a harmon mute. Now, the harmon mute is a very important part because harmon mute were used in jazz quite often. The big bands were groups that Still had played in, and he enjoyed it. So he's taking some of the things that he learned from big band music, and he employed them in his first movement. So you have a typical 12-bar blues. You have the trumpet playing the melody, but you have the horns answering. So in other words, we have a call and we have a response, just as you would find in traditional African American music. Now, if you played the parts just as written, the eighth notes would be very straight. Da 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 da, da 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 da. Now, what is not apparent is that in the blues style, there is a triple division of the beat. Not written, but it's understood. So that da 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 is actually da 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 da, da 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 da. And there is the difference between what's written and what's understood. And when the horns answer, da da da. So it's in the same style as the trumpet. So there are three times where you have this theme. Then there is a interesting and a fun transition that lands into a spiritual. It's called the Andante Cantabile. Cantabile means singing. So we know that this is a spiritual. It's played by the oboe. A lot of his spirituals are played by oboes. Probably one because he played oboe, and two because it creates the right mood. It's supposed to be tender, and it's played by the oboe and answered by the flute. So again, we have call and answer. You also have those blue notes. Now, You've heard me say blue notes. What specifically are blue notes? Well, in the case of this symphony, if you have a major scale, the third degree of the scale is lowered 1/2 step. The fourth degree of the scale is raised 1/2 step. And the seventh degree of the scale is lowered 1/2 step. And so this creates a pentatonic scale that's traditionally and still used in blues. So you hear these blue notes, and you hear the emotion. Spirituals came about in the African American time doing slavery. And usually they were an expression of sorrow. They were very sincere, they were very emotional. Now, originally in the 1700s, spirituals were meant to be distinguished because you had your hymns, you had your psalms, and you had your spirituals. Three different ways of singing in the church. But the spirituals were more free and they were more emotional. And so here, Still decides he wants that second movement to be a spiritual. Now you remember in the Dvorak Symphony, number 9, second movement, we have a spiritual. We call it Going Home. And it's in the oboe and English horn. So same thing, very same thing. After this section, we have a development section which goes back and uses information from the very beginning. But instead of following the rules and going back to the original theme at the end of the development, we actually go to the second theme, the spiritual, and we finish with the blues theme. Now, it's important to know that this blues theme is actually seen in every single movement, all 4 of the movements. And this is a technique or a style that I find very, very interesting. So in the second movement, and he called the second movement Sorrow. The first movement was called Longing. The second movement was called Sorrow. And sorrow, as you might well imagine, was sad. And so here the musician needs to pour out their feeling, a feeling of longing, a feeling of sorrow, not quite hopelessness, but close. What is interesting is that, like many African American singers in their styles, there is a hesitation to come in. For instance, it's called offbeat phrasing, which is a proper term. You give a downbeat, and then the singer, not playing the downbeat, not singing the downbeat, but they come in well after, and they phrase it from there. When I had a chance to work with Ernestine Anderson, and she was a fantastic singer to work with, we were rehearsing, and I gave a downbeat and looked at her, and she didn't come in. So I thought, well, I did something wrong. And so I gave a downbeat again, but I did it slower. And she didn't come in. So she said, well, you just give that downbeat, I'll be there, trust me. What happened was that in phrasing with jazz and traditional African American music, you come after the downbeat. It's called offbeat phrasing. And it's called syncopation, which means the beat is interrupted. And so I learned there that when singers are singing African American music, most times there is offbeat phrasing. Even in today's traditional rap, it's all offbeat phrasing and it's syncopated. So that hasn't changed in over a century. The second movement has a tremendous amount of offbeat phrasing. Again, it has a tremendous amount of call and response. And so this tradition that William Grant Still learned from these small churches, these small black churches in the Deep South, are now brought on the concert stage, and we can hear it played by orchestral instruments. Third movement, which is called humor, is probably the most popular of all. This movement has been taken out of the symphony very often and played all around the world. And what's interesting, besides the fact that it's fast and happy, is that it uses banjo. And tenor banjo is actually an African instrument. Most people don't know that, but banjo came from Africa. At the very beginning, there's a counter melody that you hear in the French horns. And the counter melody goes ba 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 bum 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 bum. Now, when that first came out, everybody said, oh, he's just copying from Gershwin. I got rhythm. Well, no, that's not the case. William Grant Still played in a band, and they were doing a Broadway show called Shuffle Along. Cecil and Blake were the writers, and William Grant Still played oboe in that band. And so there's a soft shoe number, and the solo for the oboe was da 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 da. So as William Grant Still was writing this symphony, he gave U.B. Blake a call and said, do you mind if I take a little oboe lick out of your Shuffle Along and use in my symphony? And Blake said, what's that? So Still took out his oboe, played it for him. He says, oh yeah, I remember that. You go right ahead. Well, what people don't know is that composers like Gershwin would always come to these shows with their notebooks and they take down rhythms and idioms and use in their own work. So when you do hear this, then when you say, oh, he stole it from Gershwin. No, he didn't steal it from Gershwin. He got permission from U.B. Blake. Gershwin was the one who stole it and got famous for it. The last movement begins with a chorale, and more like a hymn. And then it goes from there to a series of spirituals. And from the spirituals, it goes to a fast section built on the blues theme. And it ends with a big maestoso, very majestically. And it's a resolute feeling, like we will overcome that type of feeling. And at the end is maestoso. And so we have the first section being longing, the second section being sorrow, the third section being humor, and the last movement, resolute. We're resolved and we're going to make it, and it's going to be okay. We will eventually achieve our goals. And so This 24-minute symphony describes the entire Black experience. What I'd like you to do is come to our concert October 9th, Everett Philharmonic, 3 o'clock at the Civic, and you'll get to hear this wonderful orchestra play with cultural authenticity. I know they will, because these same musicians in 2005 went to Carnegie Hall and played in front of a full house. Actually, the house was sold out, and we played the Afro-American Symphony for the first time since the composer himself conducted the New York Philharmonic in the 1970s. And people were so hungry to hear it again, we sold out. And this group, although not African American, they understood it. They played with enthusiasm. They played with the cultural authenticity. They knew what the composer was trying to say. As a result, they got a standing ovation and 4 curtain calls. And so you will have the time of your life as you listen. And all these things that I've talked to you about are there, and you can identify them and enjoy the music. For those of you who are musicologists, please feel free to get a copy of my dissertation. It's at the University of Washington Library, 1990. I go into absolute detail for every movement, and I identify all those idioms that are African American. My thought, however, is not just that it's African American. It should be noted that it's American. This is American music, and you don't have to be African American to play it, as long as you understand what the composer's intent was and how to play this music with cultural authenticity. Ethnicity is who your parents are. Culture is who you're surrounded by. So this orchestra, although we have very few African Americans, culturally they understand exactly what this great work demands, and they rise to the occasion and they do it. So thank you very much for listening. Please come to my stage side chat, which will be right before the concert, and I'll answer any questions you might have about the symphony. Thank you very much. See you October 9th, 3 o'clock, Everett Civic Auditorium.